Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week of ICD-10 PCS coding. This week, we're going to be covering two challenging chapters with the respiratory system and the circulatory system. These are two chapters. If you're not sure exactly what all is involved in a procedure, you may want to look it up on YouTube or Mayo Clinic so you have a clear understanding of what the procedure is. Let's take a look at some highlights and look at some pages that I think will be helpful for you. It may be helpful to look at Chapter 2. They have some specific things about the heart and great vessels in Figure 2.12. You may want to review this section. This chapter covers things like measurement and monitoring, which you can see the first three characters are 4A0 through 4B0. Please pay special attention to the tables that describe the different characters in this chapter. We'll also be looking at bypasses, fluoroscopies, and cardiac catheterizations. An important thing to bear in mind is that cardiac catheterizations don't think of them as procedures, but they are things that can involve coronary angiograms, arteriograms, what have you, as something that can be done during a cath. So you have to read the documentation very, very carefully. If you're not sure what some of these procedures are, please look them up. I think it will save you a lot of time in the long run. Again, this paragraph right here really is helpful, and sometimes students tend to overlook it right here about cardiac caths. And again, the percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty, these can also be tricky. You have to look at the device as illustrated here. There are all these different things that can happen. Sometimes there's more than one device. Sometimes they're drug-eluting. Sometimes they're not drug-eluting. And then we have the bypasses. Important to read the documentation to determine whether it's an internal mammary artery being used, saphenous vein, what have you. The guidelines will spell out when you need to use multiple procedures. You may want to take a quick review on those. You can also see the different devices that are used here. So that's another place that sometimes trips people up. And again, now we get into Chapter 13. Chapter 13, we talk about things like endoscopic biopsies, vents, thoracotomies, and again, a lot of these come down to reading the documentation. This paragraph here gives you a great introduction to this, and one of the keys is to look at all these different root operations that are done for the procedures. So that's what I have for you. Chapter 12 to me is a little bit more challenging than Chapter 13. A lot more things that are not as intuitive. In an ICD-9 world, we just had a code for pacemaker, that was it. With ICD-10, of course, we have a much finer level of detail, and we have to do a lot more legwork, read things a lot more carefully. But I think if you follow this material in the text, read the documentation carefully, you'll get through it just fine. Please stop by or contact me if you have any questions, and I'll look forward to seeing you online. Have a great week. Bye now.